Hello everyone. So in the previous video lectures, I already explained why exactly we are going for local replication as well as remote replication. So in the present session, I will try to explain the securing the storage infrastructure. So the basic key concepts in the case of securing the storage infrastructure will cover storage security framework, the risk trade, denial of service, security domains, information right management as well as access control. So in the present scenario, we are having lot many valuable informations including intellectual properties, personal identities and financial transactions. So those informations are routinely processed and stored in the storage area. So those informations can be accessed through the network. So since all the informations are accessed by the users through the network, as a result, the storage is now more exposed to various security threats that can potentially damage the business critical data. So since it is exposed through the network, so the chances of threats as well as attacks are more. Securing storage infrastructure has become an integral component of storage management process in traditional and virtualized data centers. So it is a basic necessary step which is essential in order to manage as well as protect the informations with respect to the data centers. The storage security in a public cloud environment is more complex because I can say that the data is exposed directly on the network. So in order to protect such data, we have less control over the shared IT infrastructure as well as the security enforcement. So we can adopt more security with respect to the cloud environment, which can enable the resource sharing, including storage among multiple consumers. So if you are sharing the resources as well as the storage, such sharing might face lot many attacks as well as threats across the data center. So in the present module, we can cover a framework for security, that means information security designed in order to overcome from the security threats that may arise because of either malicious attacks or any other security threats with respect to the storage infrastructure. So here we can also consider the basic storage security implementations such as security architecture and protection mechanisms with respect to fiber channel SAN, NAS as well as IP SAN. So which also describes some security considerations in virtualized as well as cloud environment. So information security framework. So the basic information security framework is built to achieve 4 security goals. So we have to consider 4 different security goals. Those goals are confidentiality, integrity, availability and accountability service. So first we'll take what is the meaning of confidentiality. So confidentiality provides the required secrecy of information as well as which ensures that only authorized users have access to data. So in the case of confidentiality, which allows only authorized users to access the data. So which also provides the required secrecy of information, which maintains the secrecy of information as well as which gives the assurance that only authorized users can access the data. This requires authentication of users who need to access the information. So we have to suppose if you are having one data center, we are having one data center, only authorized users can access the data. Only authorized users can access the data. That is how the confidentiality will maintain the secrecy of information. The data transmitted over cables or data residing on a primary storage or backup or any other archival or any other backup medias can be encrypted to maintain its confidentiality. So we can make use of some encryption algorithm so that we can maintain the confidentiality with respect to whether the data is transmitted over the cable or data is stored on the primary storage or backup media or else any other storage medium. So those data can be encrypted so that we can maintain its confidentiality. In addition to restricting the unauthorized users from accessing the information, confidentiality also requires implementing traffic flow protection. So which also the confidentiality also provides or it also restricts unauthorized users from accessing the data. It also implements the traffic flow protection. So it also gives the traffic flow protection to the data. So these protections measures generally including hiding the source as well as destination addresses, the frequency of data being sent and amount of data sent. So while implementing the traffic flow protection, so these protection measures can generally includes the hiding of source as well as destination address, the source as well as the destination address, source and destination address, followed by the frequency of data being sent, on which frequency the data is being sent, as well as the amount of data. So next comes the second security framework goal is integrity. So integrity, which ensures the data information is unaltered. So whatever the data is sent from the host, the same data need to be reflected at the destination. Ensuring integrity requires detection as well as the protection against unauthorized alteration or deletion of information. So in some suppose if you are transmitting the data through the network, so now obviously there may be few number of attackers are trying to attack the data, as well as they may modify the data. So but the integrity ensures that the information is unaltered by avoiding unauthorized access to the data. So it also avoids unauthorized access to the data. So suppose through the network, if you are transmitting the data, obviously there may be a chance of unauthorized access, as well as the unauthorized users may alter the data. Ensuring integrity which measures the error detection as well as correction for both data and the systems. So integrity can be measured by considering the error detection as well as correction concepts. So the third security goal is availability. So this availability, which ensures that all the authorized users have reliable as well as timely access to the system. So whenever the users are trying to access the data, and those users must and should be authorized users. For those users, the data may be it should be available within the data center. So that means the availability ensures authorized users have reliable as well as timely access to the system as well as data and the application whatever present within the system. Availability requires protection against unauthorized deletion of the data. So that means, so here the availability requires protection against unauthorized deletion of the data. So unauthorized users cannot modify the data. So availability also implies the sufficient resources are available to provide the service. So suppose if I am considering availability means, so it also ensures the availability of resources. So without resources, the system cannot provide the service. So availability also covers that the sufficient resources should be available in order to provide the requested service. So the last one is accountability service. Accountability service, which refers to accounting for all the events and operations that takes place in the data center. So accountability service means it's the combination of all the events as well as the operations that takes place within the data center. The accountability service maintains a log of events, so which will maintain one log file. So that log file contains all the entries with respect to the events, so that can be audited or traced later for the purpose of security. So accountability service will maintain one single log file which consisting of all the events. So that log file can be used in order to trace any security purpose issues. So these are the major 4 security goals with respect to the basic information security framework. So the first one is confidentiality, the second one is integrity, the third one is availability, and fourth one is accountability service. The confidentiality means which will maintain the secrecy of information so that only authorized users can access the data. Integrity means the information is unaltered. Availability means the data must be available for all the authorized users on timely basis. Accountability means refers to accounting for all the events and operations that can take place in the data center, and which also maintains one single log file, and that can be used during the security purpose. So risk trade defines risk in terms of threats, assets, and vulnerability. So risk trade arises when a threat agent, that means an attacker uses an existing vulnerability, and he may compromise the security services of an asset. For example, if you are transmitting or if you are considering one sensitive document is transmitted without any protection. So we are not implemented any encryption algorithm. So as it is, if you are sending the sensitive document over the channel, but that channel is insecure channel, that network or channel is insecure channel, so that instant an attacker may attack that sensitive document, and he may access the document as well as he may violate its confidentiality and as well as integrity. So that means he may modify the data, an attacker may modify the data so that after modification as well as the confidentiality, so this may result in business loss for the organization. So in the present scenario, potential business loss is the risk. So I can say that the potential business loss is a risk which arises because an attacker uses the vulnerability of the unprotected communication. So he used unprotected communication in order to attack the data, as well as in order to modify the data. So in order to manage the risk, the organizations need to focus on vulnerability, because they cannot eliminate threat agents that may appear in various forms and the sources to its assets. So organization can also consider reduction in the possibility of occurrence of an attack, as well as they can protect the data so that the business data can maintain its confidentiality as well as integrity. So next we can consider assets, threats, and the vulnerability are considered from the perspective of risk identification and control analysis. So first we'll consider assets. Information is one of the most important asset for any organization. I can say that information is one of the major or important asset for any given organization. So other assets may be its hardware components, related software, and the other infrastructure components required to access the information. So in general, we have to give the protection. We have to give the protection for these assets, including hardware, software, as well as infrastructure components, in order to maintain the availability of the resources to the authorized users, as well as over the trusted network. So these parameters apply to storage resources as well as network infrastructures and organizational policies. So next we'll consider security method objectives. So the first objective is to ensure that the network is easily accessible to the authorized users. So that means the network is easily accessible only to the authorized users. So it should also be reliable and stable under disparate environmental conditions and volume of usage. So the available network should be easily accessible to the authorized users, as well as it should be stable under any given environmental condition, irrespective of number of users. So it should maintain its stability even if the environmental condition is disparated, as well as if you are having more number of usage. That means if you are having more number of users are trying to access the data through the network. The second security objective is to make it difficult for potential attackers. So that means the attackers cannot easily access the data from the data center. So it is the second objective is to make it difficult for potential attackers to access as well as compromise the system. So these two are the major objectives with respect to security methods. So the effectiveness of a storage security methodology can be measured by considering two key criteria. The effectiveness of any storage security. Can be measured either by considering the cost of implementing the system, as well as it should cost heavily to the potential attackers. So the cost of implementing the system should be less, should be a fraction of the value of the protected data, but for an attacker, its cost should be very high. That means it should cost heavily to the potential attackers. Either it may heavy means in terms of money as well as effort as well as time. So these are the major criterias we can consider under the effectiveness of a storage security methodology. So next we'll take threats. So threats are the potential attacks that can be carried out in an IT infrastructure. So threats are nothing but potential attacks itself. So that can be carried out with respect to any IT infrastructure. So these attacks can be classified as either active attack or else a passive attack. So first we'll consider what is the meaning of passive attack. So passive attacks are attempts to gain unauthorized access into the system. They pose threats to confidentiality of the information. So the passive attacks are nothing but attempts or number of tries in order to gain the unauthorized access. Unauthorized users are trying to access the data or trying to access the system. The second one is the active attacks. So the active attacks which may includes the data modification. So this is a major problem with respect to an active attack. So an active attack may modify the data. They may modify the data. So that means whatever the data is sent from the sender, in the network, they may modify the data and they may retransmit the data. So active attack includes the data modification. So that means the denial of service and repudiation attacks. They pose threats to data integrity, availability and accountability of the data. So whenever the data is modified, that means I can say that integrity of data is lost. As well as it may give the negative impact on the availability of the data as well as accountability of the data. But in the case of passive attacks, so directly an attacker may read the data as well as he may copy the data, but he will not modify the data. So these two are the two different types of attacks. The first one is passive attack and the second one is active attack. So in a data modification attack, the unauthorized user attempts to modify the information for a malicious purpose. So in the case of data modification attack, as the name specifies, an unauthorized user will try to modify the information. So a modification attack can target the data at rest or the data in transmit. So these attacks pose a threat to data integrity. So obviously if the data or information is modified, that means I can say that the data is modified means it will affect on the data integrity. So next we'll consider denial of service or DOS. So DOS is an attack which prevents legitimate users from accessing the resources as well as services. These attacks generally do not involve access to or modifications of the informations. So in the case of DOS, denial of service, the unauthorized users or legitimate users are trying to access the data as well as resources as well as services. But these attacks do not involve access to modify the data or the information. Instead of that, they pose a threat to data availability. threat to a data availability. Means the unauthorized user is trying to access the data, but the same data will not be available for the actual authorized users. So that is why which may affect in the data availability. The intentional flooding of network or website to prevent legitimate access to the unauthorized users is one example for DOS. So that is denial of service. So in the case of denial of service, I can consider the intentional flooding of a network. Intentionally, the data traffic or data is flooded on the network or the website to prevent the legitimate access to the authorized users. So that is one example for denial of service. So the last one is repudiation. In the case of repudiation, is an attack against the accountability of information which attempts to provide false information, which attempts to provide the false information by either impersonating someone or denying that an event or a transaction has taken place. So in the case of repudiation is a kind of attack against the accountability of information. So which attempts to provide the false information to the authorized users. So in the case of repudiation, which provides the false information by either impersonating someone or denying that an event or transaction has taken place. So but in the case of repudiation, which provides the false information to the unauthorized users. So next comes vulnerability. The path that provides access to the information are often vulnerable to the potential attacks. So the path that provides access to the information, either it may be a network. So each of the paths may contain various access points. So suppose if you are having one user, from the user into the actual data center, we are having few number of access points. So I can say that this is one path to access the data, and within each path it contains various access points. Which provides different levels of access to the storage resources, which provides different level of access to the storage resources. It is important to implement adequate security controls at all the access point on an access path. Suppose if I consider this is one access path established between the user to the storage, I am having some access point including the network or switches or whatever. So with respect to each access point, we have to implement the security controls. So we have to implement the security controls with respect to individual access point. Implementing the security control at each access point of every access path is known as defense in depth. So what is the meaning of defense in depth? The defense in depth is nothing but implementing security for individual access point across the access path. So that is called as defense in depth. So defense in depth recommends using multiple security measures to reduce the risk of security threats if one component of protection is compromised. So suppose one component within the system is compromised, means there may be a chance of an attack. So that we are providing individual access point, we are implementing the security control. So it is also known as layered approach to security, since there are multiple measures for security at different levels. So we are level wise, since we are providing or giving the security control to the access point, we can call it as layered approach to security. Defense in depth gives additional time to detect as well as respond to an attack. This can reduce the scope or impact of security breach. So in the case of defense in depth, it takes extra time, it takes additional time in order to detect as well as respond for any kind of security or any kind of attacks which is occurred with respect to the network. So next we'll take attack surface. Next we'll consider attack surface, attack vector and work factor. So these are the three factors to be considered when accessing the extent to which an environment is vulnerable to security threats. So we'll take in detail. So first we'll consider attack surface. What is the meaning of attack surface? The attack surface refers to the various entry points that an attacker can use to launch an attack. Suppose if I am having one data, so if I am having one sensitive data over here, and so what is the meaning of attack surface? So attack surface is nothing but various entry points that an attacker can use in order to launch an attack. So through this particular point, suppose he can access the data or he can access the mission critical data. So that point is called as, or that entry point is called as attack surface. Each component of an storage network is a source of potential vulnerability. An attacker can use all the external interfaces supported by that component, such as either it may be hardware component as well as the management interfaces, to execute various attacks. So the attacker can make use of any various entry points, either it may be through the hardware or else through the management interfaces. So these interfaces from the attack surface for the attacker, even unused network services, if enabled, can become a part of that attack surface. So in some cases, even the unused network services can also be considered as an attack surface in order to get the entry point so that an attacker can launch an attack. So next is an attack vector. Attack vector is a step or a series of steps. So either a single step or else a series or multiple steps required in order to complete an attack. So what is the meaning of an attack vector? Attack vector is nothing but either a single step attack or else series or multiples of steps required in order to complete that attack by an attacker. So the next topic is work factor. Work factor, which refers to the amount of time and the effort required in order to exploit an attack vector. So work factor is nothing but the total time as well as the effort required in order to exploit an attack vector. So the attack vector is nothing but step or series of steps necessary to complete an attack. What is the work factor? Work factor is nothing but the time as well as effort required to exploit an attack vector. Security technologies are directed at reducing vulnerability by minimizing attack surface. That means entries, different entries within into the surface, as well as the maximizing the work factor. That means the time required or effort required in order to perform any kind of attack. So that need to be increased. That means maximizing the work factors. So these controls can be either technical or non-technical. So technical control are usually implemented through the computer systems, whereas non-technical controls are implemented through the administrative or physical control. So with respect to administrative control, which includes some set of policies as well as standard procedures in order to direct the safe execution of various operations. And the physical control covers setting up physical barriers such as security guards and locking systems. Based on the roles they play, the controls are categorized as preventive control, detective control, as well as the corrective control. So the preventive control attempts to prevent an attack, so which will prevent any kind of attack. Preventive control avoid the vulnerability from being exploited and prevent an attack or reduce its impact. The detective control detect where an attack is in progress, so which will identify where exactly or which particular access point an attack is in progress. Detective controls discover attacks and trigger preventive or corrective controls. So after an attack is discovered, the corrective control are implemented. So after identification of an attack, that means after the corrective control is implemented, the corrective control after an attack is discovered, later we can implement the corrective control. So corrective control reduces the effect of an attack, so which will maintain or it will reduce an effect on an attack. So these are the major categories with respect to the control, so which play the higher role based on the perspectives. So those are the preventive control, detective control, as well as the corrective control methods.